Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We're really excited to speak to you about how we speak about encryption and how we can work together to further promote and amplify not only our project, but our campaign goals and make our work a lot more relevant to your specific audiences so that we can all move closer towards our shared goals of protecting and defending encryption for all. Today, we're going to talk about what is encryption, why we care about it, what are our advocacy goals at the Internet Society with regards to encryption, how we talk about encryption, who are some of our target audiences, 4 easy ways to advocate for encryption as part of your chapter's initiatives, and 1 easy thing that you can do right now. But I will let Ryan kick us off. Go ahead, Ryan.
Thanks, Natalie. So what is encryption and why do we care about it? What does it actually mean for the internet and actually mean for the world? To kick us off, we need to first look at the basics of what encryption actually is. At the core, encryption is a way of scrambling information so that only those who have the keys, your intended recipient, the person who's sending it, can actually understand what's being shared. The way that this works is, let's say that Natalie and I are having a conversation over an end-to-end encrypted messaging app. What I do is I put in the text that I want to send to Natalie saying, "Hello, Natalie." It gets encrypted and turned into something called ciphertext. Anyone who intercepts this message, any bad guy who sees this ciphertext would just see nonsense. They wouldn't be able to see that I wrote, "Hello, Natalie." Once the encrypted message gets to Natalie's phone, it'll get decrypted, turned back into the clear text of "Hello, Natalie." Then Natalie can read the message that I sent her and send something back. The key thing here is encryption makes information unintelligible, but not inaccessible. Anyone could access this encrypted text when it's being sent across the internet, but they're not going to be able to use it because it just looks like nonsense. One key thing that I do want to mention is the difference between encryption and end-to-end encryption. For our project, one of the major things we focus on is end-to-end encryption. With end-to-end encryption, I think of it as encryption in this classic sense, where only the intended recipient and the sender of the message actually decipher and read the message. No one else has the keys to decipher this message. This is a really important piece of technology because it protects messages very well from any third party trying to get access, and it's one of the hardest things to break into and one of the best ways of protecting communications on the internet. All that to say, encryption is very important on the internet for trust and also just in our daily lives. In terms of ensuring your messages are private and safe, encryption's important for things like messaging apps, but it's also important for things like air traffic control, e-voting, even financial transactions. All of those have to be protected by encryption in order to keep them safe and to ensure that we have trust in those processes. No one would use online banking if they thought that their password or their credit card information was going to get stolen. Same thing goes with online shopping or even shopping with credit cards or debit cards in person. One thing people don't really realize is that on credit cards that have chips in them, those chips actually come with encryption physically on the credit card. And every time you use a chip and pin credit card, you're actually relying on the security of encryption to keep your information on your credit card safe and to keep your money out of the hands of someone who might want to spend it. The other thing is it keeps your identity safe. Encryption not only provides confidentiality, but it also can help provide authentication. It can help make sure that the person that you think you're talking to actually is the person that you want to be talking to and not somebody else who's impersonating them. The other thing is it's very important for national security. We've seen lots of governments moving to end-to-end encrypted messaging services or other types of services to keep their information safe. I'm American, and actually something that came out recently was the US military is moving to using Signal, which is an end-to-end encrypted messaging app, for its people on the ground abroad who are actually doing official communications. They're relying on end-to-end encrypted messaging apps to secure their communications. The last thing is personal security, especially for people who are in groups that may be at risk in some parts of the world, individuals who are from the LGBTQ community or activists or journalists. End-to-end encryption and encryption are quite literally life and death. It allows people to express themselves more fully online and communicate with others who might be at risk without the fear that what they're communicating might be accessed by someone else and could be used to damage them or to hurt them. One very interesting thing in the past year was the sea change that we saw in the narrative around encryption. A lot of this had to do with the effects of COVID-19. In our global effort to fight back against COVID-19 and to mitigate the effects of the pandemic, a lot of people were asked to stay home as part of the COVID response and to work from home. And a lot of commerce, a lot of institutions, education, et cetera, all had to move online in order to function. Because of this, people started relying on the internet and relying on the security that encryption provides in whole new ways. If you're a 10-year-old in the United States who suddenly was going to elementary school on Zoom, you would know that Zoom needed to be encrypted so that you're keeping yourself safe, and your parents would know that no one else is watching your children going to school. And actually, around Zoom, there was a big conversation about, is Zoom truly end-to-end encrypted? Because they said they were end-to-end encrypted, but they actually weren't. So now Zoom has taken action to become end-to-end encrypted if you turn it on. But there was a big blowback against Zoom because everyone was relying on it, but they found out that the protection that was being offered by Zoom wasn't as good as Zoom had said it was. And there's been a bigger understanding of the importance of encryption in people's lives and the importance of end-to-end encryption. At the same time, in 2020, we still see governments trying to undermine and prevent the use of strong encryption. Like I said earlier, end-to-end encryption or strong encryption is one of the best ways to keep yourself safe online. And the reason for that is it keeps any third party from getting access to the contents of your communication. Only you and your intended recipient in this conversation or recipients can actually access the clear text or the content of what's being said in this conversation. Now, this is a really important thing for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. But at the same time, governments and law enforcement are concerned that end-to-end encryption prevents them from getting access to the communications of criminals or suspected terrorists. And for that reason, many governments around the world have attempted to undermine the use or prevent the use of strong encryption, either through law or policies or through other means, sometimes just intimidation. And because of that, they're putting this tool that provides incredible security and privacy to users across the world and greatly improves the trustworthiness of the internet at risk. It's not just the trustworthiness of the internet that's at risk, but it's also ourselves and our personal security. If you look at the Internet of Things, for instance, a lot of the Internet of Things has provided new ways for digital threats to become a lot more physical. People can now hack into cars. There's smart toys for children that have been hacked into where the kids are being talked to. A lot of these IoT devices and systems leak information and are not as protected as they could be with encryption. It means that could be a lot of economic harm and a lot of personal harm for folks. Recently, there was news about Amazon Ring, which, for people who don't know, it is a IoT device that is a security camera. There have been some instances where Amazon's Ring's cameras have been hacked. There have been threats and racial slurs. But at the same time, Amazon has recently mentioned that they're going to take Amazon Ring and make it end-to-end encrypted and hopefully lock out some of the data leaks that have been happening and also protect the systems more. So what are our advocacy goals for this project? At the Internet Society, our main goal for encryption is to grow the use of end-to-end encryption around the world. More people need to be using end-to-end encryption to protect themselves, and more businesses need to offer end-to-end encrypted products. People aren't going to be using end-to-end encryption if there's no products for them to use. With more use of end-to-end, it becomes a more trustworthy internet with less data leaks and less damage to trust online. And people will be more likely to use the internet for more things to help improve their lives. The second thing we want to do is stop different governments' attempts to undermine encryption. We're mainly focused on about 10 target countries. These are countries that we see as worldwide leaders on encryption for good and bad. And so these countries are the UK, France, Germany, the EU more broadly, Australia, Japan, the United States, Brazil, and Canada. All of these countries we see as sort of bellwethers for the rest of the world when it comes to encryption policy. If they take the right path on encryption, then perhaps they can sway many other countries and governments around the world to follow them in protecting and supporting encryption. But if they go the other way or undermining the use of strong encryption, then many other countries in their regions or around the world might just follow suit. And so What we're trying to do this year and what we tried to do last year was stop these laws and policies from going into place. The other thing that we're trying to do this year is turn this into more of a mass movement. Although there's been an increase in understanding of encryption and the importance of encryption, this is still very much a niche issue. Most people don't realize that they're using encryption when they're using it, and they certainly don't realize the difference between end-to-end encryption and encryption. This year, we're trying to get at least 1 million people participating in our campaign and understanding the importance of encryption and the importance of encryption in their lives. I saw a question about these countries and why these are important to cover. These are countries where we see active threats, and we also see them as influential in their regions. For instance, India just recently passed these intermediary guidelines, indirectly threatened to undermine encryption. If other countries in the region pass similar guidelines, then that could be quite bad. So how do we do this? Our approach to advocacy is fourfold. The first is thought leadership, building up not just us as the Internet Society, but our community, our chapters, and our partners as leaders on encryption. Groups and people who policymakers and the media go to when there's questions about encryption, so that we can make sure that there's a strong understanding of why encryption is important and what's at risk when it's undermined. The second is building a movement. How do we get more people involved in this campaign? By people, I also mean communities. There's a lot of communities out there who really rely on encryption, but they don't know that it's very important in their lives. For instance, the LGBTQ community might not realize how important encryption is. One group that we've worked with in the past and continue to work with is domestic violence survivors. This is a group that really relies on encryption to get help and to support one another safely. But not all of these groups that work with domestic violence survivors realize that encryption is important and something that's under threat. Also, in terms of building a movement, not just communities of people, but different communities of businesses and business sectors. If you look at something like the mining sector, that's becoming a heavily digitized sector where they're using IoT devices a lot more. And there's a lot of data that could be leaked or stolen by competitors that should be protected by end-to-end encryption. If you ask the normal mining executive around the world, they're not going to know anything about encryption and not know that they need to protect encryption. Finding these groups and getting them in the movement and excited about protecting encryption for their own reasons is really a key thing that we all need to do. The third is raising new heroes. Once we find these communities, find these people, how do we make sure that they're skilled up on encryption and understand how to do advocacy and be effective advocates? Part of that is this session right here. Fourth thing is mobilization and direct advocacy. Going out there, talking to policymakers, working with communities to make sure that encryption is protected and encryption is being promoted around the world. This is really what we're doing in that list of countries I mentioned, is working with local partners, working with our chapters, working with others to do this direct advocacy and ensure that encryption is protected and the threats that are apparent to encryption there don't actually materialize.
And I actually want to quickly touch on a question that Carson had in the chat. Encryption appears to be increasingly under siege by LEAs, law enforcement agencies. And there's a number of legislative proposals that are trying to be passed right now. 100%. And Ryan has just touched on our approach to advocacy and how we try and organize ourselves to push back on some of these threats. This debate often tends to revolve around tech industry versus law enforcement. What we need to do to fundamentally change the narrative is to get other stakeholders part of this conversation, other stakeholders that have really critical viewpoints that are often not heard or considered when these proposals are on a table. And they're really important to consider because everybody has a stake when it comes to encryption. When we think about advocacy, there's opportunities for advocacy every day in every way. So whether we're talking to a policymaker, you're talking to your friends and family, there's always an opportunity to talk about why it's important to protect, defend, and use encryption in our day-to-day lives. At the Internet Society, in trying to change this global narrative on encryption, we've put together somewhat of a strategy to help us flip the narrative in more favorable terms for us and protectors of encryption. Our strategy is fairly simple. One is keep it simple, while we very much have the experts that can go super in depth into how encryption works and why certain proposals can weaken encryption and poke holes in our digital security shields. We also recognize that we need to talk about this really simply, because even if you're talking to a policymaker, people might not have the technical backgrounds. We need to be able to talk about this in really plain language so that everyone has a clear understanding of what's at stake and why encryption is so critical to us all. The second point is we try to discard unfavorable terms. You'll sometimes hear about these proposals being referred to as lawful access proposals to access encrypted content. The very nature of using lawful access alludes that it's a lawful thing to do. In many countries, it is not legal to do that. Even where it is being proposed, it could contradict other privacy laws or what have you. So when we hear about proposals that try and give law enforcement access to encryption, we try and call it out as we see it. We're trying to propose backdoors to encrypted content, which is really what they're doing. In addition to that, we try and put the opposition on defense. So when somebody does propose a way to give access to encrypted content, we really try and put the onus on them to prove, because we often get into situations where we're talking to policymakers and say, if I can't get access to encrypted content, how am I going to catch the bad guys? And we flip that. We say, well, everybody wants to keep people safe online. It is inherently important. However, we cannot do that by making everybody around the world even more vulnerable to the same criminal activity we're trying to prevent online. So please show us and demonstrate to us how what you're proposing doesn't do that, because so far technical experts around the world have shown that this is not possible. That's a really critical point in our messaging strategy, because then there's no way to get out of that. There hasn't been a proposal to date for backdoor access that doesn't make everyone weaker to the stuff that we're trying to prevent online. The next point is we just really try and repeat our key messages. If you're talking to people about encryption and you're sick of hearing yourself repeat the same thing, especially if you're talking to journalists, then you're doing the right thing. Let's say you're speaking to a journalist, you might have a half-hour conversation, and if they quote you, they might take one line. Make sure that one line is one of your key messages. And then finally, we have to make it hit home. It's really important to find ways to talk about encryption that people can relate to, because people often have a million different priorities in their day-to-day lives, especially in our ongoing struggle to get through a pandemic. People are easily distracted, but if you can find ways to talk about encryption in ways that matters to their day-to-day safety and the security of their families or of their work priorities, then that is going to have a better chance of sticking than just simply the facts. As I said, we have a general messaging framework. This gives us a framework of how to talk about encryption, why it's important, why it's critical to support personal and national security, how backdoors make everyone more vulnerable, same crime we're trying to prevent online, and what everyone needs to do to protect and promote encryption around the world. It's really important that when we look at this framework, we consider, who are we talking to? Are we going to speak to a journalist who's writing for a publication that's like niche for policymakers, or is it niche for tech audiences? Or are we going to speak to maybe a local school about how they can improve their best practices on keeping staff and students safe online? The way that we talk about encryption really needs to be tailored to who we're talking to, because that's really the only way that we're going to make it hit home. Here's a list of target audiences at the Internet Society that we've listed as some of our priority audiences. They can be segmented even more, but generally we consider our target audiences to be government leaders and policymakers, decision makers in target industry sectors, civil society industry organizations, influential journalists, influential target segments in focus countries, being those countries that Ryan mentioned where we see the most imminent threats in the forms of proposals to weaken or ban encryption. And then consumers who are informed and who care about digital security and who can help us amplify our campaign. What we do is we take our messaging framework and then we think about, among these target audiences, who are we going to speak to? For example, influential journalists. My background before joining the Internet Society as director of Advocacy way back when, my roots are in journalism. So I still have a lot of friends who are journalists. In speaking to them about encryption, a lot of them don't know about it, except that they do use it when they're using Signal to speak with their sources, or especially if they need to be keeping their sources confidential. end-to-end encryption is critical to that. And even more so if they're reporting in countries where it is not always safe to do your job as a journalist and where there's a serious threat to your physical safety, end-to-end encryption is all the more important, and that instantly hits home to them. Ryan, I think you have an example of speaking with a policymaker that you've been able to tailor our key messages to that you want to share?
Yeah, definitely. And to some of the notes in the chat about nothing to hide, one of the things that one of my colleagues, Robin Wilton, mentions always with nothing to hide is people say they have nothing to hide, but they should really be saying nothing to hide from who? Everyone has something to hide from somebody. And the person that they could be hiding it from could be a criminal or an identity thief. Everyone has things to hide. They might not think they have things to hide from the government, but end-to-end encryption protects you from the bad people who are there to steal your information or steal your identity. When I talk to people who are informed consumers or semi-informed consumers about digital security and digital privacy, that's an argument I always make, is that people always have something to hide from somebody. They may not think that they have something to hide from the government, but they do from somebody. The other thing that I wanted to note, tailoring your message to an audience or a specific person. One quick anecdote I have is back in 2018, we were working with the Australian chapter of the Internet Society on advocacy in Australia around their encryption law. Unfortunately, that law passed in the middle of the night in Australia, right before the end of the Australian legislative session, for a lot of different reasons. We had some really good success on meetings with legislators in Australia by tailoring our message directly to them. One quick anecdote was we were there with our chapter. We had our big roundtable at the Parliament House in Australia on encryption. And we really wanted to have a one-on-one meeting with this one office of an independent legislator there. One of our chapter members is pretty well informed with politics in Australia and said he really seems to care about checks and balances and adequate controls over powers. That's his big deal. And so when I called his office right out of the blue and said, hey, we're here for 2 days. Our chapter wants to have a meeting with you on encryption. This is really important because you could have bad overreach of this policy without adequate checks and balances. Within the next hour, we got a meeting set up the next day, and our chapter went and met with him. He actually ended up being an opponent of this encryption bill. That could have partially been because of the work that our chapter did. And that came about because a member of our chapter realized, hey, he cares about this one thing, which is related to encryption. I think we can pull him on side. We just need to get him with a hook. The hook to starting the conversation is about checks and balances, but the conversation really is going to be about how you can't undermine encryption with this law and policy. That's why it's so key for us to work with the chapters and our membership, because you all know your countries. You all know the politics, you know the politicians, you know the policy sector, and we will work with you and do our best to make sure that we can make the biggest impact that we have. But a key part of that is tailoring our message and tailoring our strategy to the different countries and different audiences that we're focused on. And that was just one really good example.
Thanks, Ryan. So as Ryan mentioned, as chapters, you're super critical to our success. You know your audiences, you know your regions. If you're advocating for encryption, you have your ear to the ground. We find at the Internet Society that when we do collaborate on advocacy, that's when we can have the biggest impact, but really taking a cue from our chapters and how we can play the best supportive role. Some chapters do a lot of advocacy already, and then some might be interested in doing it. So what we're going to focus on today is for easy things you can do to strengthen our global campaign. And then afterwards, perhaps we can have a chat about some of the things we can do if you want to take things to the next level.
Yes, so we have 5 activities that we've put up as options for activities you can do after this fundamentals program to help support encryption. One of these is doing a practical webinar of how can you use encryption to stay safe, teaching people to use end-to-end encrypted applications or to turn on encryption when it's an option, but it's not turned on by default. If you look at something like Facebook Messenger, you can put on end-to-end encryption, but you have to turn it on every single time that you want to use it. So not super practical, but something that people need to realize that they can do to give a little more safety for themselves, especially if they're communicating really private information on it. The other thing you can do is conducting a webinar or briefing meeting with policymakers on the importance of encryption. One thing that happened after our training course last year was ISOC Ghana held a session with the Ministry of Communication on encryption and the importance of encryption. This is the ministry that does a lot with journalists and communication in general. And so it was really great to have our chapter go out there and talk to them about why encryption is so important and add another voice, work on building the Ministry of Communication in Ghana to being a strong voice internally in the government of Ghana on encryption. And so that's something that people can do that's very helpful, is not even when there's a threat in your country to encryption, taking action, working ahead of time on building understanding of the importance of encryption for your nation and for the economy and even for just government function. The other thing that we have, which is available for chapters to contribute to and is a really helpful resource, is a world map of encryption laws. This was actually put together by a partner organization called Global Partners Digital, based out of the UK. And it's a one-stop shop for you to check in on the encryption laws that are in place around the world. You can see some countries have minimal restrictions, others have some, and some places like, for instance, China, have widespread restrictions on the use of encryption. This is a really good way of checking in and seeing in your country if there's laws already on the books that impact encryption. At the same time, we are looking for more regional input on this. If you're interested in providing more information about a law that you might not see from your country that does impact encryption but isn't on this map, you can reach out to Global Partners Digital directly, and they're looking for input on the map and help making sure that this map is up to date and is a good resource for people.
The other initiative that you can choose to do is to share your why it matters story. Bringing that human element to the conversation is really important to make that understandable to people. We try and do that at the Internet Society. If you follow our blog, we try and have a variety of contributions from people who can bring different viewpoints on why encryption is important to them and their communities. But this is also something that you can do easily. Mr. Tell us with words, with video, or with photo, why encryption matters to you specifically and your community and the people around you. And then when telling the story, really try and help the readers understand why you personally care about encryption. How does it protect you and your community? How is your community at greater risk without encryption? What are you doing to promote the use of encryption as a chapter, and how can others join in? And then go beyond explaining how the encryption works. It's important for people to understand how encryption works, but going beyond that and saying why it matters and how it is directly involved in our day-to-day, I think that really helps people understand how ubiquitous encryption is or should be. Give real-life examples that will really help create a sense of urgency, whether you're in a country where we need to defend encryption or whether you're in a country where we can really be proactive and get people to commit to using and promoting encryption. Having these kinds of stories can really help our campaign. And in doing so on your channels, where you have a variety of chapter channels, publish on your channels with the permission of your chapters, of course, but also your personal channels. Find out where your target audiences are and share your stories where they will have the most impact.
Earlier last year, we created this Global Encryption Coalition, which is a worldwide organization of civil society, companies, trade associations, and individual technologists and cybersecurity experts, which is focused on promoting and defending encryption around the world. This is open to all chapters to join, and I think we've got about 20 chapters who've joined already, but it's a great way for folks to stay up to date on the different threats to encryption around the world, to swap opportunities for advocacy, and also best practices for advocacy. We've been seeing different groups from around the world coming up with new ways of doing self-starting advocacy. For instance, in Europe, several small businesses who are members of the Global Encryption Coalition have taken action on their own to send open letters to the European Union saying, if you weaken encryption, you're going to destroy our business and you're going to destroy the European startup community. And so it's a really good resource for chapters to join, and an area where chapters can actually provide a lot of help to others around the world who might be trying to get a handle on how they do advocacy in specific countries. And when you have threats come up in your country, this is a group that you can reach out to immediately and say, hey, there's a threat to encryption that we see that might be coming soon. Can you help us? And the members of the Global Encryption Coalition can provide technical expertise, but also advocacy expertise and best practices. And if you need guest speakers and things like that for events, this is a really good group to go to, of groups that are strong on encryption and provide a global viewpoint on these issues. So how to participate? There's 3 steps that you can take. The first is getting your chapter to join the Global Encryption Coalition if they haven't already. After you do that, you can also contact this email address to get added to the Global Encryption Coalition Slack workspace, where people share links, opportunities for advocacy, and just generally do more day-to-day communication about encryption and encryption advocacy. The third step, which we'd really like to see, is recruiting 5 members from your region to the Global Encryption Coalition who care about encryption. The Global Encryption Coalition is free. The only thing that you need to do to join is sign on to a statement which says, I support the use of strong encryption and I'm against any attempts to weaken encryption around the world. It's a very low bar, but it keeps the bad guys out. We'd love, especially if there are groups from your country or your region who may not know as much about encryption, but you want to bring them on as strong partners in the regional debate around encryption, please get them to join the Global Encryption Coalition. We're happy to talk to them about it. I'm happy to have a call with them because we'd like to have them join, and we'd really like to have more diversity in the coalition to have a much stronger voice than we have now.
We are stronger together, and the bigger the Global Encryption Coalition grows, the bigger this is really a very visible show of power to show that there is global weight behind a movement of people who want to protect and defend encryption. So this would be super helpful to our campaign. There's also one thing that you can do right now. If you would like to learn more about encryption and how it works, and even what are some different approaches to advocacy, you can register for a new ISOC e-learning program that's available for registration. And then you can also go on your social channels and encourage others to join as well. I encourage you to register. It's pretty interactive and it's a really good session, and hopefully will get you thinking about different ways that you can advocate in your regions. So with that, I thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to my colleagues to the question and answer session.
Thank you both for that, and that was a very good presentation. I was looking through the list of questions in chat, and one was, would it be correct to assert that VPNs use some form of encryption?
Yeah, so actually VPNs do use encryption. A lot of them will encrypt the tunnel that they use across the internet to help protect your information. That's really helpful for when you're on public Wi-Fi, for instance, to help make sure that people aren't stealing your information. And actually, we've seen a lot of VPN companies join the Global Encryption Coalition and be very active on supporting encryption around the world. For instance, Surfshark has been very active, but also NordVPN and Private Internet Access have been very active on encryption advocacy.
Following that is a question related. It says, if encryption is illegal in my country, how can you implement that project? VPN is the same encryption? And then how to deal with those who use advantage of autosign in email to access information, as on setting there is a place to reveal password.
First off, be very careful in your country. Don't do anything that will get you in trouble. But I think one key thing is, in countries where we've seen encryption become illegal or there's been a pushback against encryption, there's also just not an understanding of the importance of encryption or just how much encryption is actually used. I'd hazard to guess that encryption is actually probably used a lot in your country, and it just goes unnoticed. If you're using TLS 1.3, which is an internet protocol, that uses encryption. A lot of internet protocols use encryption. And so one thing that I think governments miss is that you really can't ban encryption because so much actually relies on it to function. That's the angle I would take in countries that with governments that are less hospitable towards encryption, is slowly getting folks to realize encryption is important and we actually do use it a lot. I think that's a key message that is hopefully a less inflammatory message, and one that helps. An important note for most countries is, in places where there isn't an encryption debate, or there isn't really going to be a law sometime soon about breaking encryption, really focusing on how we use encryption and increasing awareness of why encryption is important is the angle that you can take. That's a positive angle to take. It's not inciting a debate. It's more just informing people of why it's important.
Thank you for that. This one is, are there copyrights cleared rights-free images and video footage can use to prepare a video or poster as my reporting story element of this course?
One place that we often use at the Internet Society is Unsplash. That has images that you can use as long as you have the credit. But if you go to our website, there's a number of resources that you can get inspiration from for content in your stories. And we just ask that people reference them.
We have some really good resources on our website. We have infographics. There's also infographics that our partners have made that would be really useful for folks that I believe are pretty lightly copyrighted. So you can use them for advocacy as well. And I'd recommend using those for that.
I am not seeing any new questions at this point. Any final comments from you, Natalie and Ryan?
I was just going to say also, we do have a lot of our resources too that are in a Connect group called Encryption for Everyone, and they're under the library. And so it's a nice, easy one-stop shop of resources.
We just got one more question. What types of tools could be provided by ISOC to get people more involved about the importance of encryption?
One really good thing that we can do is blogs and outreach in that way. And that's actually something I'd really love to work with chapters on, is if there are things in your country where you know that you can make a case for why encryption is important to them or people in your country, that I think is really a good way of doing this. One blog that we did 2 years ago now is called A Day in Life with Encryption. It goes through a fictional person's day and talks about how they use encryption many times on a daily basis. This blog was definitely written from more of a Western perspective, either European or US or Canada perspective of someone who lives in a city. Also, it was written before COVID. And so the day in the life for the average person is going to differ all around the world, and also now differ because of COVID. One thing that I could see is really cool for members to do is to create their own version of a day in the life of encryption focused on people in your country or your region. What does a day with encryption look like in your region? I think that's a really cool way of getting more consumers involved with encryption, more average people involved with encryption, because it makes it much more real when you realize that, oh, I used my credit card today. Wow, I used encryption 3 times just in one transaction. Those sorts of things are really cool. For instance, if you're based in Kenya, does M-Pesa use encryption? I think it does, at least to a degree. Those sorts of regional nuances would be very cool to have put out in blogs by chapters or put up on websites like that.
Okay, real quick, we have a couple of new questions. I have to ask one. Will there be other ISOC encryption related opportunities for the community, for the chapters?
100%. So these are some of the easy things that we talked about that you can do. But we are planning to launch an inaugural Global Encryption Day later this year. I won't go into any level of detail at this point, but I will just say, please watch your inboxes and keep in touch with your community engagement managers, because there are definitely going to be opportunities to participate as leaders in a campaign leading up to Global Encryption Day. And we really hope that we can do this as one big global collaborative effort together, because we're stronger together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to thank you again, Natalie, and you, Ryan, for your time. Thank you so much, all the attendees who showed. We thank you so much for your participation, and we know that you'll be the advocates you can be. So thank you, and good luck.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.